want to tell you a little bit about Dr. al-Azm. I first met Dr. al-Azm in Damascus when I was doing some research at Palmyra. And at that time, he was director of the Office of Conservation and Technology at the Department of Antiquities at the National Museum in Damascus. And was just a wonderful, wonderful contact. And from there forward, we've tried to coordinate what we could do to work together between BYU and his contacts at the National Museum, as well as he was also teaching at the University of Damascus at that time. So he's been a wonderful support and a wonderful host to all of us, including students that we bring over for various projects. Dr. al-Azm is almost royalty. I mean, we also should, maybe we should. He is descended from the Pasha al-Azm, who was the builder of the Ottoman Palace in Damascus, which is a current project that we're starting up in Damascus with Amr and his colleagues there. So it was interesting because when we met some Palestinians that were at a conference in Damascus this last spring, one of the older men met him, and he said, the Pasha, okay, because the name is well known throughout greater Syria. So in a way, you're in the presence of historic greatness, I guess, genealogically. He is currently a professor at the University of Damascus and the director of the Archaeological Research Institute there. And I won't tell you the stories that I know about him as a child in Beirut, making cannons with live ammo during the Civil War to blast little kids across the courtyard and blowing up his mother's apartment. But with no further ado, I'd like to present to you Dr. Amr al-Azm. Thank you. I'm sorry, I neglected my responsibilities here. We are indeed grateful for the financial support that we've gotten from the Middle Eastern Studies Association, MESA, and also the Kennedy Center, and also the National Center for Arabic Studies. So thank you very much to make this possible.
Thank you, Cindy, for that delightful introduction. In this day and age, presenting me as a errant child attempting to blow up my mother's apartment, God knows what he'll do now. I promise you I intend to blow nothing up, but perhaps expand your knowledge and minds by giving you an insight into what is happening in our part of the world today. I thank Cindy, Dr. Finlayson, and the center here for making this possible. And I would like to take this opportunity to begin by giving you a brief historical sketch of events in Lebanon and Syria. The reason why I decided to do this is because I'm not sure how au fait my audience is with events, and the events are historically interlinked. So you must excuse the tedious historical prelude if you want. The other thing I also realize is that in today's current climate, many of you might be, although I know the title of the lecture is Syria and Lebanon and the relationship between them, I know many of you might also be interested in Syria's relationship with the current situation in Iraq. So in the question time, I would also gladly field or answer questions on that part. You may also wish to ask questions about the role of Islam and terrorism, or the role of Middle East and the relationship of the Middle East with the West, and so on and so forth. I would also field questions of that nature. I realize that you may all have different reasons for wanting to come and listen to this, and I'll try and accommodate all of you. Anyway, as I said, I'm going to begin with a brief historical, chronological, if you want, list of events. I decided to start with the 1840-1860 events in Lebanon and Syria, because I think they were really a starting point for what is to come later. In 1840 and 1860, internecine warfare erupted between the Druze, which is a Muslim sect, and the Maronites, the Christian Maronites, which is a Catholic offshoot. The massacres that were perpetuated by both sides resulted in thousands of people dying and movement of people between the two countries or the two areas. Druze migrated from Mount Lebanon to the Hauran region, which is in the southern part of Syria today, and a lot of Christians, as a result of the massacres in Damascus in 1860, migrated out of Damascus into the coastal regions of Syria and Lebanon, particularly Beirut. So a lot of the Maronites today living in Beirut, who proclaim deep, if you want, cultural and ethnic roots with the Lebanese Phoenicians, are actually not really of the area, but are actually migrants from the 1860 period into that part of Lebanon. Following the 1860 massacres, from 1861 to 1915, in response to Western pressure, the Ottoman government created a special province which was ruled by a non-Lebanese Christian mutasarrif. And this is the first time we hear the word Lebanon mentioned. So the word Lebanon comes in with the post-1860 events as a country or as a province. Before that, it didn't exist. After the First World War, the French yielded to Maronite insistence, particularly after the suffering and deprivations that they suffered during the Ottoman withdrawal from Lebanon. Something like over 10,000 of them starved and over 100,000 were made homeless. So it was quite a hard period for them. They prevailed on the French to actually create a Christian, if you want, Lebanese state. But they also persuaded the French to add the coastal ports, the coastal towns, such as Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon, and they also included the internal fertile plain, the Bekaa Valley. In doing so, they also incorporated into their Maronite state a lot of Muslims, which was to come back and haunt them, if you want, later on in their history. After 1947, that was independence for the Lebanese, a national pact, a power-sharing accord was created, whereby the major religious groups would share power, based according to their different percentages then. It was decided that the president and other key posts, such as the army, would go to the Maronite Christians. The prime minister's post would always be Sunni Muslim. The speaker of parliament would be a Shiite. This, however, this entente, if you want, cordial, was not to last, because by the mid-late 50s, there were already serious strains on this arrangement. And this confessional power-sharing arrangement was basically breaking up. Things would come to a head in 1975 with the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War, what we call the first part of a 20-year civil war, we call the 2-year war. So between 75 and 76, a very ferocious civil war erupted between the Christian Maronites on the one side and what we call the Haraka Watani, or the national movement, which was an umbrella for both political movements and religious movements. So you had on the one side the Christian Maronites, on the other side you had the Druze militias, you had the Shiite militias, you had the Sunni militias, you had the Palestinians, you had the communists, you had the socialists, you had the, Arab pan-Arabists on the other side. It was during this period that the very first Syrian intervention occurs into Lebanon in 1976, where the Christian Maronites were on the verge of losing. The national movement forces had reached an area called Ayun al-Siman, which is overlooking the last strongholds of the Christian Maronites. There, at that moment, the Syrians intervene on behalf of the Christian community there in order to stop the war. Of course, the Syrians did not intervene on behalf of the Christian militiamen because they felt that they were in the right or because they wanted to help them, but because it was in the best interests of not only Syria but the Arab world in general to maintain a status quo where no clear winner is emerging from this debacle. Part of the reason for that is that should a national group or a national liberation front or a Palestinian group or any such group suddenly take up arms against an existing governing system and win, it would open the eyes of other minorities or other potential armed groups or other Palestinians living in other Arab countries who might also then begin to consider that armed options may be a way of changing governments. So it is very important at that time to make sure that the status quo is maintained. In 1982, the Syrians were forced to withdraw from Beirut following the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. They were able to hold on to their positions in the Bekaa Valley, and a new set of lines, confrontation lines, were drawn here. Amin Gemayel, who was the head of the Christian militiamen, was installed as president by the Israelis, and in return for that, he signed an agreement for normalization of relations with Israel. The Syrians took great exception to that and demanded immediate abrogation of the treaty, and sure enough, by 1984, following the suicide bombings of the Marine barracks and the French in Beirut, the American troops finally withdraw from Lebanon. Without that cover, the Lebanese government could no longer maintain this treaty and had to abrogate it. From 84 right on to the beginning of 1990, Syria maintained a position that there would be no peace in the region if it is not a Syrian peace. So no Pax if it's not Pax Syriana. And they maintained that position right the way through. In 1989, the Taif Accord was signed. This is when all the warring factions of Lebanon were brought together under the auspices of the Saudis in Riyadh and with the help of the Rafiq Hariri, who then became the prime minister of the country, in order to, if you want, redivide the cake between them. And of course the Syrians had a major role in that because they were going to enforce the peace. 1990 and the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait greatly accelerated this process because in return for Syria joining the coalition, they were allowed finally to exercise Pax Syriana in Lebanon. So the trade-off was, you come into the coalition, you get Pax Syriana in Lebanon. And of course, $1 billion from the grateful Saudis, which I'm sure was greatly appreciated by the government then, and well spent. The price to pay for the Lebanese of the Pax Syriana was, well, for some it wasn't such a terrible price because it meant that the militias were gradually stripped of their arms. General Aoun, who now features very prominently in the news, basically, who had also declared a insurrection against the Syrians, was finally surrounded in his final stronghold, was soundly defeated, and basically exiled to Paris, whereas some of the others were imprisoned. And a period of calm, relative calm, then prevails over Lebanon. Rafiq Hariri as president, as prime minister, rebuilding the country, but totally under Syrian hegemony. During that period, many of the Lebanese politicians, warlords, both Muslim and Christian, who at one time may have been anti-Syrian, pro-Aoun, or pro-Israeli even, were now vying for the attention of Damascus, seeking financial and or political support for their claims, aims, whatever. In fact, 80 years ago, a well-known French consul, I can't remember his name now, complained that the Lebanese would set their country on fire in order to light up a cigarette. If that is true, then this would be a prime example of it. In 2003, the Third Gulf War erupts. This is when the Great Crusade against Iraq comes to being. Syria here is now in the opposite camp. It aligns itself with those against the war. And so, again, its position is changing in terms of how the world sees it and where it sits in world events. Autumn 2004, Syria forces a change in the Lebanese constitution to permit the extension of President Emil Lahoud's extension to remain as president. Emil Lahoud is a very strong ally, both politically and economically, and I will explain that later on, of Syria. And this move was strongly opposed by Hariri and other groups in Lebanon. An anti-Syrian coalition is formed, including the Druze Walid Jumblat, who is very sore at losing out some of his oil money kind of business deals. And many other Maronites as well joined the coalition against the Syrians. Momentum builds up against the Syrians, demanding a complete Syrian withdrawal. And by May 2005, February 2005, Hariri is assassinated. May 2005, the last Syrian troops withdraw. June 2005, fresh Lebanese elections with a clear win for the Hariri coalition. It should be noted, however, that the turnout was relatively low. Estimates range from between 25 to 35%, and in one of the rounds it was up to 40%, no more. So 25 to 30% really was the average across the board for voter turnout. Okay, so that's just a brief sketch of events which I felt necessary in order to put things into perspective. Who's running the show? Well, I'm going to start by talking about Syria. The current regime today is best described as an oligarchy, encompassing both military and commercial interests. And it rules through what has been dubbed a merchant military complex. So, the military feeds off the merchants by getting money to survive, to pay off their cronies, their people, to maintain their positions of influence and power. And in return, the merchants get the protection and are allowed to do, by and large, what they want, provided they don't venture into politics. A very convenient arrangement which started up when the father, Hafez al-Assad, took over, and by and large has continued through to now. This in turn has led to the creation of what I would call a kleptocracy, which has worked to the benefit of both sides, both the merchants and the military complex that is running the country effectively. Upon the death of Hafez al-Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad taking over in 2000, 1999, not 2000, a power struggle then emerged as to who really is in control of the country. The power struggle is within the oligarchy and not from without. There is no serious opposition to the oligarchy in Syria today. And I would divide these into three main groups. The first group, or these are the, if you want, the three main players in the game. The first player is the first family. That is the president, his immediate family, his brothers, his first cousins, etc. And if you want, you could add the new guard to them. The new guard would be defined as those who have come in with the new president or have aligned themselves very strongly and very closely to the new president. So they are his people. The second group, what I would call the old guard, and these are those of the president's father's generation. Most of them have basically survived, lived, and are very comfortable with the old way of doing things and want to maintain that. That is not to confuse that the new guard want to do things any differently or want to improve things or want to change things for the better, for the common good. It's just who basically establishes their right to rule here. It's a struggle for, is it my word or your word? Is it my say or your say that runs here? Then there is a third force. This is a very important force here. This is a group from within the oligarchy which has begun to trade in its old, if you want, money for protection, racketeering, whatever you want to call it, business practices that were prevalent for legitimate businesses. So they are, in a way, laundering the money that their fathers made before them. They are cleaning up the image of the families. They are bringing in legitimate business practices. They're opening up restaurant chains. They're investing in trade. They're investing in also, telecommunications, computer companies, etc. Media, they're big in the media area, so on and so forth. Now, this third force is acutely sensitive to how the world perceives Syria and how they perceive Syria as well, because any threat to Syria's stability is a threat to the stability that they so desire in order for their money to keep working and to bring more business for them. So if there is a threat to Syria, external or internal or otherwise, as a result of the policies of the old guard or the first family, which might lead to them losing their wealth or their control over their wealth, then that is a serious threat to them. So if Syria were to be embroiled in a big dispute with America, and America were to intervene in Syria and change the regime, then that would be totally against their interest, because then they risk losing their money and influence. Because remember, they are part of the oligarchy. So they want peace, quiet, things to go normal, keep making money, keep doing business, so on and so forth. There is also a very important point here, because this new force is also undermining the old merchant military complex, which had existed happily. These new traders, these new businessmen don't need the old merchant class anymore to make money for them. They can make it themselves. So they're also distancing themselves from the old merchant class. And that means they are in competition with that merchant class. And if they're in competition with that merchant class and they have the power, then that merchant class is losing out. So they have also created new enemies within the system as well. They've broken down old ties, old established ways of doing business. They've introduced new ways of doing business, and they basically work for themselves. They don't work for the first family. They don't work for the old guard. Ultimately, this oligarchy and the way it has ruled Syria through this merchant military complex, through this new rising business class, if you want. All this has led to a system that has worked outside what is really necessary for a state to function. I.e., what I'm trying to say here is that these people basically have run the country or run their businesses, not necessarily to the benefit of national policy, national security, national interest, etc. Which means you have really two systems operating. You have the national system, the existing political framework, the security needs of the country as a country, the economic needs of a country as a country, and then you have these private systems, these private interests, which operate in the shadows. So when we talk about Syria, and when we think of Syria, we have to remember this. When you talk of the Syrian government, you have to realize which government are we talking about? Are we talking about the main government? Are we talking about these oligarchic private interests? The two cross over very easily, but they are also separate. Why do I talk about Syria? Well, because this power struggle is directly mirrored in Lebanon as well, because there is also an oligarchy in Lebanon. There's an oligarchic system in Lebanon, which is based on clans and warlords, and these Lebanese clan chiefs and warlords, come politicians, are also in the game. And by aligning themselves with or against struggling factions within the Syrian oligarchy system, they also rise and fall and benefit or suffer from the system. So, if I am within the Syrian oligarchy system, and I wish to direct a blow at another one of the groups, and I don't wish to do it within Syria directly, I can do it indirectly in Lebanon and get the same effect. So, if I, for example, blow up Hariri, I am effectively neutralizing a very important section of the old guard. That's not to say that the Syrians blew up Hariri. Please don't quote me on that. That's not what I'm saying. But what is important here is that by benefiting from this relationship, they are benefiting from Syrian hegemony in Lebanon, thereby indulging in this mutually beneficial kleptocracy. It is therefore inevitable that as the power struggle intensified in Damascus, it would also be reflected on the Lebanese scene. I'd like to now bring us to three main questions that I would like to pose and attempt to answer as best as I can. The first serious question for me is, why did Syria, and in particular Bashar al-Assad, insist on extending Lahoud's term of presidency? For some, including myself, this was a fatal error. It brought unwanted attention and incredible pressure on the Syrian government, which could only end in one way. That is the complete and total withdrawal of Syria from Lebanon. So in a way, you were cutting your own head off, if you want. You were shooting yourself in the foot. Is it possible that they were not aware of that? Is it possible that they were so naive that they didn't realize that the world had changed so much in the last 10 years that this would be the outcome of such an event? Well, it is possible. But I would also like to look at another option, and that is that it was inevitable, it was necessary for them because of the interests that exist, the strong business links that exist between Lahoud and his son and the first family. And in order to preserve these interests and financial dealings, or if you want, misdealings, it was felt that it was necessary to extend for Lahoud 3 years. Not a full term, not 2 years, not 1 year, 3 years, because they felt that this is the time they would need in order to clear up any loose ends. And also to, I think, prepare Frangieh, who's the young grandson of the Frangieh who was president during the 75-76 civil war, and a very close ally of Syria, to prepare him for the next presidency. But at the same time, this set in chain a series of events which led to the assassination of Hariri and the withdrawal of the Syrians from Lebanon. The next big question is, who was responsible for Hariri's assassination? Before we even touch on that, I should like to remind you that Hariri was a very controversial figure. Today, we hear people from all sides or across the whole Lebanese spectrum singing eulogies for him. But one must remember that in the 10 years before, most Lebanese had anything but contempt for that man. The Maronites hated him for basically being the instrument of their humiliation and demise. The Shiites hated him because he was a Sunni and did not represent their interests. The Sunnis, even a lot of the Sunnis, hated him because he was basically a cutthroat business tycoon who was out there to make as much money as he could for himself and for his cronies, both in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Saudi, and the Gulf, where he got most of his money. So, and the Druze were, on the one hand, happy to play along if there was something in it. For that. By the Druze, I should mean here Jumblat. I don't mean the sect as such. I'm talking about Jumblat here. Walid Jumblat was happy to play along as long as he was getting something out of it for his pockets. Remember, a warlord like Jumblat needs very, very deep pockets in order to pay off his people. Otherwise, he wouldn't remain warlord, because a warlord has to pay off his people. They have monthly salaries that they need to receive, and if they don't get their money, then he doesn't get to be warlord anymore. Somebody else will be. So, Hariri was a very controversial figure for the Lebanese. And whilst he did rebuild Lebanon, whilst he did bring about a peace, he was also despised for doing it under Syrian hegemony and for being so deeply in with the Saudis and with groups that were felt were not really for the interest of the Lebanese. Okay, who was responsible for Hariri's assassination? It would be improper for me to, try and name names here, purely and simply because there's an ongoing international investigation, I would hasten to add. So perhaps we should wait for the results of that. But I would like to perhaps shed light on who might benefit from the assassination of such a person. Well, in some ways, yes, the Syrians would benefit from the death of Hariri, because had Hariri not been assassinated, had he not died, he would have most certainly won the forthcoming elections, and he would have made an implacable foe for the Syrians. He was very, very deeply hurt, both, even physically, I would say, by what the Syrians did to him in forcing him to sign the change to the constitution. He was deeply humiliated by that, and he intended to extract his pound of flesh from the Syrians. So by getting him out of the picture, yes, the Syrians would benefit. They would have removed a very strong center of opposition there. But in return for the assassination of Hariri, they basically incurred even more of the world's wrath on them, and it led to a ignominious almost rout in their departure from the Lebanon. So is that worth a price? Is that a price worth paying for the Syrians? Another potential beneficiary are Hezbollah and the Shiites. There is no love-lust between the two groups. Remember, Hariri's main base is Sidon, which is also in the south of Lebanon, which is also the main base for the Shiites. And throughout the 90s, and even from before the 90s, there has been competition between the Hezbollah and other Shiite groups and Hariri for vying for influence in the area. Plus the fact that Hariri made it his personal business to basically take on Hezbollah whenever he could. So they would definitely benefit, because if he won the elections and came to power by sweeping the board, he would certainly he would certainly show them no mercy this time round, because with the Syrians out of the picture, they would be next on his hit list, and this time perhaps for good, with American or Western help. So they would definitely benefit also from his demise. It's also worthwhile noting here that the withdrawal of the Syrian army, or what appeared to be almost a complete rout of the Syrian army from Lebanon, also holds some benefit to the Syrian president. Remember, this is a president who is trying to exert his control over a power struggle within his oligarchy. And some of the important key players within this struggle were also army officers in the Lebanon. In the Lebanon, they were able to cut their own deals. They were able to bargain away, sell, buy, trade, thereby becoming financially independent, if you want. Upon their return to Syria, they would lose this financial, if you want, relationship, and they would become dependent on the palace itself now in order to, if you want, make money. So if they were not 100% loyal to the palace, there would be no money. Whereas if they were in Lebanon, they could easily make alliances with the Lebanese oligarchies, if you want, and make money on the side and not be directly linked, if you want, to the palace and the power system within the palace. That is the presidential palace in Syria we're talking about here. So the return of the army from Lebanon also in some way helped Bashar consolidate his power over the military. The third and last question here that I would like to pose is, following Syria's exit from Lebanon and the success of the Hariri through his son here and the anti-Syrian camp in the elections, what is the nature of the new Syrian-Lebanese relationship going to be like? Well, if you've been watching the news, you know that the Syrians have been imposing embargoes on Lebanese goods going in and out and so on and so forth. I mean, the Syrians, or let's say the Lebanese, cannot do without the Syrians. Syria is Lebanon's breathing space. Lebanon cannot exist economically, commercially, without having access to Syrian borders. And in fact, historically, whenever the borders have been closed between Syria and Lebanon, and that's been on 2 other occasions, they've both been by the Syrians in punishment for whatever misdemeanor that the Lebanese had committed against the Syrians. So I think that the reason why the Syrians are, if you want, rattling the cage a bit, the Lebanese cage that is because they want to remind the Lebanese of that special relationship, that whether the Syrian army is in Lebanon or not, that there is that special, that they do need them. And that whilst they are trying to form a new government, an anti-Syrian government, it needs to also balance itself in such a way, not be too anti-Syrian. Otherwise, there will be no dialogue. If it is, if you want, extremely anti-Syrian, then there can be no dialogue with the Syrians because the Syrians won't accept that, and then there would be a total breakdown of relations. And in a way, it has worked to the Syrians' benefit because now Signora is going to have to rush, or whoever, in fact, we know now is Syria, but whoever at the time was going to become prime minister was going to have to rush as soon as he could, once he sorted out his cabinet, to the Syrians and try and mend fences. And this is what's been happening in the last few days. So I would say in the medium term that eventually a perhaps more healthy relationship will emerge between the Syrians and the Lebanese. But it must also not be forgotten that the events that we witnessed in Beirut and in Lebanon this last year will have a major impact on the Syrian political scene as well. It is of no little consequence that people power was able to bring about radical change. And this has not gone unnoticed in Syria. So, and I'd like to end here.